You didn't leave any nasty-smelling chemicals cooking over a Bunsen burner, did you, Mother? Charles Wallace asked. Mrs. Murray stood up. No, but I think I'd better go see what's upsetting Fort anyhow. It's the tramp, I'm sure it's the tramp, Meg said nervously. What tramp? Charles Wallace asked. They were saying at the post office this afternoon that a tramp stole all of Mrs. Bunscombe's sheets. We'd better sit on the pillowcases then, Mrs. Murray said lightly. I don't think even a tramp would be out on a night like this, Meg. But that's probably why he is out, Meg wailed, trying to find a place not to be out. In which case I'll offer him the barn till morning. Mrs. Murray went briskly to the door. I'll go with you, Meg's voice was shrill. No, Meg, you stay with Charles and eat your sandwich. Eat? Meg explained, as Mrs. Murray went out through the lab. How does she expect me to eat? Mother can take care of herself, Charles said. Physically, that is. But he sat in his father's chair at the table, and his legs kicked at the rugs, and Charles Wallace, unlike most small children, had the ability to sit still. After a few moments that seemed like forever to Meg, Mrs. Murray came back in, holding the door open for... Was it the tramp? It seemed small for Meg's idea of a tramp. The age or sex was impossible to tell, for it was completely bundled up in clothes. Several scarves of assorted colors were tied about the head, and a man's felt like a perched atop. A shocking pink stole was knotted about a rough overcoat, and black rubber boots covered the feet. Mrs. Watson? Charles said suspiciously. What are you doing here? And at this time of night, too? Now, don't you be worried, my honey. A voice emerged from among turned-up coat collar, stole scarves and hat, and a voice like an unoiled gate, but somehow not unpleasant. Mrs. What's-it? Says she lost her way, Mrs. Murray said. Would you care for some hot chocolate, Mrs. Whatsit? Charmed, I'm sure, Mrs. Whatsit answered, taking off the hat and the stole. Isn't it so much that I lost my way as that I got blown off course? And when I realized that I was at little Charles Wallace's house, I thought I'd just come in and rest a bit before proceeding on my way. How do you know this was Charles Wallace's house? Meg asked. By the smell. Mrs. Whatsit untied a blue and green paisley scarf, a red and yellow flowered print, a gold Liberty print, and a red and black bandana. Under all this, a sparse quantity of grayish hair was tied in a small but tidy knot on top of her head. Her eyes were bright, her nose a round, soft blob, her mouth puckered like an autumn apple. My, but it's lovely and warm in here, she said. Do sit down, Mrs. Murray indicated a chair. Would you like a sandwich, Mrs. Whatsit? I've had liverwurst and cream cheese. Charles had bread and jam, and Meg lettuce and tomato. Now, let me see, Mrs. Whatsit pondered. I'm passionately fond of Russian caviar. You peaked, Charles cried indignantly. We're saving that for Mother's birthday, and you can't have any. Mrs. Whatsit gave a deep and pathetic sigh. No, Charles said. Now you mustn't give it to her, Mother, or I shall be very angry. How about tuna fish salad? All right, Mrs. Whatsit said meekly. I'll fix it, Meg offered, going to the pantry for a can of tuna fish. For crying out loud, she thought. This old woman comes barging in on us in the middle of the night, and Mother takes it as though there weren't anything peculiar about it at all. I'll bet she's the tramp. I'll bet she did steal those shoes. And she's certainly no one Charles Wallace ought to be friends with, especially when he won't even talk to ordinary people. I've only been in the neighborhood a short time, Mrs. Whatsit was saying as Meg switched off the pantry light and came back into the kitchen with the tuna fish. And I didn't think I was going to like the neighbors at all until dear little Charles came over with his dog. Mrs. Whatsit? Charles Wallace demanded severely. "Why did you take Mrs. Buncombe's sheets?" "Well, I needed them, Charles dear." "You must return them at once." "But, Charles dear, I can't. I've used them." "It was very wrong of you," Charles Wallace scolded. "If you needed sheets that badly, you should have asked me." Mrs. Whatsit shook her head and clucked. "You can't spare any sheets." "Mrs. Buncombe can." May cut up some celery and mixed it in with the tuna. After a moment's hesitation, she opened the refrigerator door and brought out a jar of little sweet pickles. "Though why I'm doing it for, I don't know," she thought as she cut them up. "I don't trust her one bit." "Tell your sister I'm all right," Mrs. Whatsit said to Charles. "Tell her my intentions are good." "The road to hell is paved with good intentions," Charles intoned. "My, but he isn't cunning." Mrs. Whatsit beamed at him fondly. "It's lucky he has someone to understand him." "But I'm afraid he doesn't," Mrs. Murray said. "None of us is quite up to Charles." "But at least you aren't trying to squash him down." Mrs. Whatsit nodded her head vigorously. "You're letting him be himself." "Here's your sandwich," Meg said, bringing it to Mrs. Whatsit. "Do you mind if I take my boots off before I eat?" Mrs. Whatsit asked, picking up the sandwich nevertheless. "Listen." She moved her feet up and down in her boots, and they could hear water squelching. "My toes are ever so damp. The trouble is that these boots are mite too tight for me, and I never can take them off by myself." "I'll help you," Charles offered. "Not you. You're not strong enough." I'll help. Mrs. Murray squatted at Mrs. Whatsit's feet, yanking on the one slick boot. When the boot came off, it came suddenly. Mrs. Murray sat down with a thump. Mrs. Whatsit went tumbling backward with the chair onto the floor, sandwich held high in an old claw. Water poured out of the boot and ran over the floor and the big braided rug. "Oh, dearie me," Mrs. Whatsit said, lying on her back in the overturned chair, her feet in the air and one in a red and white striped sock, the other still booted. Mrs. Murray got to her feet. "Are you all right, Mrs. Whatsit?" "If you have some liniment, I'll put it on my dignity," Mrs. Wallet said, still supine. "I think it's sprained. A little oil of cloves mixed with garlic is rather good." And she took a large bite of sandwich. "Do please get up," Charles said. "I don't like to see you lying there that way. You're carrying things too far." "Have you ever tried to get to your feet with a sprained dignity?" But Mrs. Whatsit scrambled up and righted the chair, and then sat back down on the floor. The booted foot stuck out in front of her and took another bite. She moved with great agility for such an old woman. At least Meg was reasonably sure that she was an old woman, and a very old woman at that. Mrs. Whatsit, her mouth full, ordered Mrs. Murray, "Now, pull while I'm already down." Quite calmly, as though this woman and her boots were nothing out of the ordinary, Mrs. Murray pulled until the second boot relinquished the foot. This foot was covered with a blue and gray argyle sock, and Mrs. Whatsit sat there, wiggling her toes and contentedly finishing her sandwich before scrambling to her feet. "Ah!" she said, "that's ever so better," and took both boots and shook them over the sink. "My stomach is full, and I'm warm inside and out, and it's time I went home." "Do you think you'd better stay till morning?" Mrs. Murray asked. "Oh, thank you, dearie. But there's so much to do. I just can't waste time sitting around frivoling." "It's much too wild a night to travel in." "Wild nights are my glory," Mrs. Whatsit said. "I just got caught in a downdraft and blown off course." "Well, at least your socks are dry." "Wet socks don't bother me. I just didn't like the water squishing in my boots. Now, don't worry about me, lamb." Lamb was not a word one would ordinarily think of calling Mrs. Murray. "I shall just sit down for a moment and pop on my boots, and then I'll be on my way." Speaking of ways, pet, by the way, there is such a thing as a tesseract. Mrs. Murray went very white, and with one hand reached backward and clutched at a chair for support. Her voice trembled. What did you say? Mrs. Whatsit tugged at her second boot. I said, she grunted, shoving her foot down in, that there is, shove, such a thing, shove, as a tesseract. Her foot went down into the boot, and grabbing shawls, scarves, and hats, she hustled out the door. Mrs. Murray stayed very still, making no move to help the old woman. As the door opened, Fortinbras streaked in, panting, wet, and shiny as a seal. He looked at Mrs. Murray and whined. The door slammed. Mother, what's the matter? Meg cried. What did she say? What is it? The tesseract, Mrs. Murray whispered. What did she mean? How could she have known?